Today, we're going to take a look at the Donald Trump approval rating after about 6 months back in office. We're going to go pretty quick through a variety of different sources, and this is technically 1/8 of the way through the new administration. Some of you are going to love almost everything about it, others are going to hate everything, but this is kind of the point where the rubber meets the road. The honeymoon period is over, and voters are starting to figure out if they like what they're seeing or if they maybe want to go in a different direction, maybe even back toward the Democrats. So we'll start here on Real Clear Politics. Now, the dates of these polls are July 6th through the 21st, and in the aggregate, Trump is at 45.5 approve, 52.6 disapprove. He's underwater by 7.1. And then we've got all the polls that went into this aggregate. Here's the sample size and whether it was adults, registered voters, or likely voters. When you look at the individual polls, there's definitely a lot of range. A couple are much more friendly to Trump, and a couple are in the other direction. He's only above water in 2 of these, and several of these are double digits in the red. Now, if we go down here and take a look at the long-term trend, when Trump got back into office, he did start off positive. He had a little bit of a honeymoon period, but it was only maybe a month or two. Then he's back underwater here in March. Then ever since then, it's widened up, it's narrowed, and now it looks like it's widened up again. But how much does an approval rating at 45% really mean? In one sense, he's underwater. In another sense, you kind of got to compare it to what happened before Trump. That means Biden in Trump's first term. So let's do that. Let's take a look at that first term. Here, the entire first term, he averaged 42.8% according to Real Clear Politics. His first year was actually his lowest, where he was at 40.5, 13.5 points in the red. Somehow he managed to get even better, topping out at minus 8.7 in his final year. If we go down here and look at the longer term trend, you could see he really had almost no honeymoon period. He basically started off underwater. Then it widened up dramatically pretty early on in his presidency, but this was also pre-COVID and pre-inflation. Then it looks like he more or less settled in during his second and third year in office. And that fourth year is when COVID hit and everything kind of went off the rails by the time he finally left office. So everything is relative and it's also unpredictable. Can a president really sustain anything above 50% approval anymore? Well, if we look at the previous president, Joe Biden, during his one term in office, he finished in the aggregate at 39% approve, 57.1 disapprove, 18.1 underwater. And how did he do during his entire term? Well, Biden started off much more in the positive territory. Compared to what we see now, this looks great. He was riding high into the summer. Then once the Afghanistan withdrawal happened, he sank underwater and never looked back. That was also around the same time inflation started to really kick in. Then with a little bit of variation, Biden ultimately finished with pretty weak approvals. Now, what I usually say with approval ratings is pretty much everything has to be going right to maintain popularity. If you've got 9 out of 10 things in your favor, but just one of them is off the rails, voters might fixate on that and your approval rating might suffer. Plus, approval ratings don't necessarily tell you how people are going to vote. Of course, if they're really high or they're really low, that is going to be a good indicator. But when you're somewhere in the middle and you're talking about maybe a few points difference, then who knows how that might actually translate into election results. There are going to be people that approve that just don't turn out to vote, and there's also going to be people that disapprove that cast a ballot in their favor. There is a whole lot to consider out there, but the biggest topic is probably going to be the economy. Now, during Trump's first term, he was actually pretty good with this metric, but that didn't really help him in the midterms, so the economy is not everything. But with Biden and inflation, that really hurt the Dems' chances. Now that Trump's been in there for 6 months, voters are hoping that whatever Trump is doing, it's going to pay off for their wallets. Here on Real Clear Politics, just on the economy, Trump is at 42.6 approve, 54.9 disapprove. He's underwater by 12.3. So just like the overall approval rating, these are not great numbers. Headed into a midterm, Trump is at least going to want to get these numbers up 2 or 3 more points. Another indicator is the direction of country. That asks if we're headed in the right direction or on the wrong track. Right now, these numbers are similar to the economy. It's 41.6 right direction, 54 wrong track. And if we go down here and take a look at the long-term trend, this goes back to a year ago. And you can see it was way, way underwater back then. It was only in the 20s that said we were headed in the right direction. And once Trump got back into office, right here, then it narrowed up considerably, but it is still underwater. So this is another metric to keep your eye on. If over the next year this starts to head more and more into the red, that's likely to be a pretty bad midterm for the GOP. Now let's move on to a different source, and because 538 is no longer a thing, instead we've got the silver bulletin from Nate Silver. So let's go down into it and see what he shows. It's not going to be dramatically different from what we just saw on Real Clear Politics. He's got Trump at 53.8 disapprove, 43.5 approve. I do miss having 538 around as a second source for all the aggregate data, but unless they come back someday, this is what we're going to have to use. Now sticking with Nate Silver, what about Trump's approval on the specific issues? Here they've got immigration, economy, trade, and inflation, and it shows you the trend since he got back into office. His best issue was clearly immigration, but now that has slipped underwater as well. The other three metrics I think are all kind of similar. You could file them all under economy, but they break them down with trade and inflation. Inflation is going to be his lowest. That one I think is going to be pretty tough for any president. The prices shot up dramatically about 3 or 4 years ago. People are tired of getting squeezed out of more and more. So short of prices actually dropping, which I don't think is going to happen, it's either going to be whoever is in power is going to be viewed highly negatively on inflation and the economy, or voters are eventually going to get used to the high prices and hope they level off. Maybe then the approval rating could start to come up in that metric. Let's move on to Decision Desk. Again, we've got the same long-term trend, and they've got Trump at a 53.7% disapprove, 43.7 approve. Again, not too dissimilar from the other sources. Now here we could isolate it just with independents. That's a key subgroup. And here they've got Trump at 60% disapprove. That's pretty substantial. Only 34.9 approve. And for this metric, it's been underwater the entire time. It got close right here in February. But independents, not a fan of the administration. However, sometimes the source matters. And if we get onto Civiqs, here they've got Trump at 42 approve, 55 disapprove. But if we isolate just the independents and take a look at their data, then these numbers are not nearly as bad as Decision Desk. Remember, they had Trump at 60% disapprove. Here he's only at 55. And they had Trump at about 35 approve. Here he's at 39. So about 9% better here with the independent data on Civiqs. Now you could also look at some of the other demographic data. You could do age, education, race. That would take way too long to go through it. So you could take all the data in at once and come to your own conclusions. Now how about on the Economist? This is tracking Trump's approval rating at 184 days in. Let's see what they've got. This shows you the comparison to Trump's first term, Biden, and Obama's first term in 2009. So right now, Trump is at minus 15%. That line is pretty much overlapping where he was in his first term. Of course, it's way below Biden and Obama, but all four of these lines have a downward trajectory. Now, as I said before, it is helpful to compare these numbers to Biden and Trump's first term. I don't think it's that helpful to go back as far as Obama. But let's look at another source. Here's New York Times. And here they've got Trump at 44 approve, 53 disapprove. That's close to what we see in the entire video. If we go down here, in the top left, we can compare Trump's second term to Biden. And Biden clearly started off higher, and he remains higher through day 185. And this goes to show you how much of a snapshot in time it is. At this point for Joe Biden, he had to be feeling great. He's above water by double digits. We were coming out of the coronavirus, and inflation was starting to kick in, but it hadn't really hit the public yet that was saying it was going to be transitory. And of course, it was prior to that Afghanistan withdrawal. Now in the top right, it's Trump's first term and his second. This might be the best one-to-one comparison. We saw this a little bit earlier, but during Trump's first term, he was more unpopular. Right now on day 185, he's at minus 10. In his first term, it was minus 16. And it's even more shocking because, again, during Trump's first term, people did not think the economy was bad. They actually felt pretty good about it, even a lot of Democrats. But there's a lot of different angles to this Trump presidency. His personality is a big factor, the executive orders. Maybe now it's even the Epstein files. But if we look at the bottom left, that's going to compare Trump to Obama. Of course, Obama was actually pretty popular during most of his first term. Definitely compared to what we see today, he looks like he was extremely popular. He was at plus 21 here. Even George W. Bush, he was also similar at plus 22. Those were completely different presidents during totally different political time periods, during different circumstances. Now it seems like whoever the incumbent is, a lot of the public is not going to be a big fan. But that's going to take us into the last page. This is on Wikipedia. This is going to show you a table of all the aggregate sources. We took a look at some of these in this video, Real Clear Politics, Decision Desk, etc. They've got the approval, the disapproval, and then the net rating. Now, for whatever reason, the disapproval is in green instead of red. Even if they decided those are the colors that work best, I'm not a big fan of it. We're used to red being negative and green being positive. But with all that said, what is the conclusion here? Well, Trump 2.0, after 6 months, his approval ratings not that good. Compared to his first term, they're also not as bad as we've seen in the past. The economy and inflation, those are going to be the biggest weaknesses. He's got to get those numbers up at least a few points if he's going to want to stand a reasonable chance in the next midterms. We know most Democrats are going to be opposed to probably 95% of the agenda. Republicans, on the other hand, seems like 90% of them are going to be a fan of about 80 to 90% of the agenda themselves. Independents are going to be in between. But right now, he's also losing support with that group. There's definitely time for the economic sentiment to get a little bit better. The tariffs and the trade deals could end up working out over the next year. If they do, the midterms might not be that bad for the Republicans. But if they don't pick up at all or they get a little bit worse, then we could be talking about a blue wave. Voters were totally unsatisfied with the way things were going before. That's how Trump got back into office. But usually with the party out of power, it seems like Dems are just going to be hoping Trump is so unpopular that they come back in there and then they're in power for a little while, but then they also have unfavorable ratings and then it swings back and forth over and over. Nobody really seems to be able to get anything right. There's the economic stuff, there's the cultural stuff. Both sides have some stuff voters like, but when they're in power, they got to get everything, and eventually the bad stuff starts to become the motivating factor, and that's why politics keeps swinging like a pendulum. It's at least a really simple, surface level way to put it. But anyway, that's where Trump is at after 6 months back in office. So let me know in the comments, what do you think about his approval rating? Do you think it's actually higher and these polls are missing his voters? Or do you think it's actually lower and people don't like what they're seeing at all? How is this going to affect the midterms next year? And what do you think about the Dems? Do voters want them back, or do they think that they're totally awful in a different direction? Let me know what you think down below. On your way out, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join if you'd like to support the channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.